Touch her, Colton said, his voice so low it was almost subterranean, and I will take you apart. He stood between her and two armed men, 6'7" of scar tissue, and fury bleeding from a wound that had torn open for the third time in his life. This was the same man who 6 months earlier had looked at her on a train platform and said she should go back where she came from. The same man who had refused to write her a single word. The same man who had slammed every door in the house hard enough to shake the walls. And now he was bleeding for her. But to understand why, you need to go back to the beginning. Back to a farmhouse in Missouri where three sisters played a cruel joke on the one they called the ugly one and accidentally gave her the greatest gift of her life. She stood on the platform at Pine Bluff Station with nothing but a trunk, a carpet bag, and the quiet terror of a woman who had just gambled everything she had on three men she had never met. The train was already pulling away behind her, trailing smoke and noise into the September afternoon, leaving her alone at the edge of what felt like the end of the world. The platform was little more than weathered planks laid across packed earth, and the station house was a single room with the town's name painted on the side in letters that had been fading since before she was born. A yellow dog slept in a patch of dying sunlight near the ticket window, unbothered by her arrival, unbothered by anything at all. The wind came down off the mountains and pulled at her skirts and tugged loose strands of honey-colored hair across her face, and Eliza Bennett, 24 years old, and 5 feet 3 inches of dust-covered, traveling dress and road-weary determination, clutched her carpet bag against her chest like a shield and stared at the empty platform and understood with the cold clarity of a woman who had spent her entire life being disappointed that she had made a terrible mistake. Nobody had come. 3 men on a mountain had read her letter and looked at her photograph, the awful one, where she was squinting because the sun was in her eyes, and they had decided that loneliness was preferable to what they saw. The wind picked up. The yellow dog shifted in its sleep. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow, indifferent to the small woman standing alone on a wooden platform with everything she owned and nowhere left to go. Then she heard footsteps. Heard not one set, several. Heavy, deliberate, the kind of footsteps that belong to large men who are accustomed to making the ground know they are there. But that moment, that first sound of boots on wood that changed the entire course of her life, did not happen by accident. It happened because of a joke. A cruel, calculated, sisterly joke that began 6 weeks earlier in a farmhouse parlor in Independence, Missouri, on an August afternoon when the heat pressed against the land like a hand trying to hold something down. The Bennett farmhouse sat on 12 acres of decent Missouri soil, and it was the kind of house that looked respectable from the road, but showed its true nature up close, where the paint peeled and the porch sagged, and the garden gate hung crooked on its hinge, because Edwin Bennett had 4 daughters and no sons, and the things that needed fixing always outnumbered the hands available to fix them. Eliza sat on the porch that afternoon with her mending basket, sewing a torn hem on her youngest sister's dress, the third one that month. Rosalie was careless with beautiful things, probably because beautiful things came to her so easily that she never learned to value them. Beautiful things had never come easily to Eliza. Through the open window, she could hear her sister's voices from the parlor, 3 voices tangled together in a pitch she had come to recognize over 24 years of living in their shadows. It was the pitch that meant someone was about to be humiliated. Lately, that someone was always her. Vivian's voice rose above the others, bright and sharp as a blade fresh from the whetstone. "Oh, this is absolutely wicked. Mother would simply die if she knew." "Mother doesn't have to know." That was Charlotte, always the boldest. "Besides, it's just a bit of fun." Eliza's needle paused. Her sister's fun usually meant harm for someone. She set down the mending and moved quietly to the window, staying just out of sight while the August heat pressed against her skin, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its evening song, oblivious to the cruelty brewing inside the house. "Read it again, Vivian." Rosalie's voice sweet as poisoned honey. Vivian cleared her throat with dramatic flair. 3 brothers seeking bride. Owners of Eagle Ridge Ranch in the Wind River Range, Wyoming territory. Seeking woman of gentle nature, modest beauty, and strong character for marriage. Must be willing to relocate to remote mountain country. Serious inquiries only. Charlotte snatched the newspaper. Father heard about the Eagle Ridge operation from his business associates. 3 brothers named Dawson. They own over 5,000 acres. cattle timber, everything. But they live on a mountain half a day's ride from the nearest town. No woman in her right mind would agree to that. Then why would three wealthy men need to advertise for a bride, Rosalie asked. Because they live like wild men on a mountaintop. Charlotte laughed. No civilization, no society, no culture whatsoever. Then Vivian went quiet. That particular silence made Eliza's stomach go cold. She knew that silence. It was the silence of a snake coiling before the strike. What if, Vivian said slowly, we sent someone to them? The quiet that followed pressed against the walls like something alive. You're not thinking what I think you're thinking, Rosalie whispered. Oh, but I am. Each word was carefully chosen and perfectly aimed. Dear sweet, unfortunate Eliza, 24 years old and never been courted. Father's greatest disappointment. The daughter who inherited mother's mousy coloring and father's unfortunate nose instead of any of the Bennett beauty. Vivian, that's cruel even for you, Rosalie said. But she was giggling. The sound of that giggle, small and mean and familiar, cut deeper than any of Vivian's words ever could. Is it cruel or is it genius? Vivian was warming to her scheme, her voice gaining the momentum of a runaway carriage. Think about it. The rancher wants modest beauty. Well, Eliza is certainly modest. He wants gentle nature. She's about as threatening as a church mouse. And strong character. She's put up with us for 24 years, hasn't she? Charlotte howled. Oh, Lord. The look on their faces when she steps off that train. They ordered a bride and received a scarecrow. We'd be doing everyone a favor, really. Vivian continued, her voice taking on a mock-serious tone. Eliza gets out of father's house. You know he's desperate to marry her off. And these mountain men get exactly what they deserve for being too uncivilized to court a woman properly. How would we even do it? Rosalie asked, and Eliza heard the shift from mockery to genuine conspiracy. Simple. We fill out the response in her name. Father has that daguerreotype of her from last year, the one where she's squinting, makes her look even worse than usual. We send it with a lovely letter about how she's eager to begin a new life out west. And when father finds out, it'll be too late to back out without embarrassing the family. Eliza backed away from the window. Her heart hammered so hard against her ribs she thought the sound might carry through the walls and betray her. She pressed her back against the rough, clapboard siding and closed her eyes and forced herself to breathe. She should storm in there. She should confront them, tear up whatever letter they were composing, march to her father's study, and expose the whole scheme. That was what a sensible person would do. But Eliza did not do any of those things, because underneath the hurt and the humiliation, underneath the familiar burn of being the family joke, a tiny seed of something else was sprouting. Something dangerous, something reckless, something entirely unlike the quiet, invisible girl she had always been. 24 years of evidence accumulated in her mind. The birthday her father forgot entirely. Not Vivian's birthday or Charlotte's. Never those. Hers. The Sunday when a visiting minister's son asked her to dance, and Charlotte intercepted him before he crossed the room, steering him away with a laugh and a hand on his arm, and nobody noticed and nobody cared. And Eliza sat alone by the punch bowl and watched herself disappear. The Christmas when every sister received a new dress, and Eliza received Charlotte's cast-off, rehemmed, and presented without apology. The evening when a potential suitor came to dinner and looked at all four Bennett daughters and fixed his attention on Rosalie without ever learning that Eliza had a name. These were not dramatic cruelties. They were small ones. Small and daily and ordinary. The kind that build a prison so slowly that the prisoner forgets the walls are there. 3 men, not one. 3. On a mountain, far from everything, far from this house where she would always be the plainest daughter, far from mirrors that showed her all the ways she failed to measure up, far from dances she was never asked to, and suitors who looked right through her on their way to court her sisters, far from a future she could see stretching ahead with painful clarity, growing old in this house, becoming more invisible with each passing year until she was nothing but a shadow stitching other people's torn hems. What if this cruel joke became her only chance at escape? The thought was barely formed before she tried to crush it. Sensible women did not board trains to marry strangers. Sensible women did not travel alone into territory they had only read about in newspapers. Sensible women did not gamble their entire futures on 3 men who lived on a mountaintop in Wyoming and had to advertise in a newspaper because no woman within 100 miles would have them. But sensible women also did not spend 24 years being invisible, and Eliza was beginning to suspect that being sensible was just another word for being afraid. The thought sat in her chest like a coal, small and glowing and impossible to ignore. She picked up her mending again. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was already on the train. 6 weeks later, the reply arrived. Eliza was collecting eggs from the henhouse, her apron already spotted with yolk from a cracked shell, when she heard Vivian's shriek of laughter carry across the yard. She knew that particular quality of laughter, the kind that came at someone else's expense. By the time she reached the dining room, all three sisters were crowded around the table, passing a thick envelope between them. Their father, Edwin Bennett, stood nearby with his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets and his expression carefully blank. Eliza recognized that expression. Calculation. The look of a man who saw an opportunity to solve a problem that had nagged him for years. "Father, you have to see this," Charlotte gasped between giggles. "Our little joke actually worked." Edwin Bennett's eyes found Eliza standing in the doorway, and something flickered across his weathered face. He was running numbers. He was always running numbers. "Eliza, come here." She approached slowly, still clutching her basket of eggs, feeling every eye in the room like the point of a needle. Vivian thrust the envelope at her with a grin that was equal parts triumph and disbelief. "Your mountain men have accepted your proposal. They sent train fare and everything." The envelope was thick. The paper was quality. Better than anything the Bennett household used. Inside, Eliza found pages covered in 3 distinctly different hands, and the breath went out of her body. The first section was written in a bold, neat script that wasted no words. "Dear Miss Bennett, I received your letter and photograph with interest. I am Garrett Dawson, eldest of 3 brothers. I am 37 years old, a widower with a 4-year-old son named Jack. I will not mislead you about the nature of this arrangement. I am not a romantic man, and I do not make promises about love or passion. What I can offer is security, respect, and a comfortable life. Wyoming is hard country and mountain life is demanding, but for a woman of strong constitution, it can be rewarding. The choice is yours entirely. Respectfully, Garrett Dawson." Where another woman might have heard rejection in those words, Eliza heard something she had never been offered before. Honesty. Pure, uncut, undecorated honesty. No flattery, no false promises. No pretty lies designed to make her feel beautiful when she knew she was not. Just a man telling her exactly who he was and exactly what he could give. It was, she realized, the most respectful thing anyone had ever said to her, because it assumed she was intelligent enough to handle the truth. Below Garrett's letter, in a softer, slightly slanted hand, another voice spoke. "Miss Bennett, my name is Emmett, the youngest brother. I want you to know that Eagle Ridge is the most beautiful place I have ever seen. The aspens turn gold in autumn, and the elk come through the valley at dawn. We are not polished men or eloquent speakers, but we are honest, and at Eagle Ridge, honesty is worth more than beauty." The third brother, Colton, had not written a single word. At the bottom of the letter, Garrett had added a brief note. "My second brother, Colton, sends his regards." Eliza would learn later that this was a lie. Colton had sent nothing at all. His silence was a wall already built against a woman he had never met, a refusal to participate in something he viewed as a betrayal of a ghost. Beneath the letter was a bank draft for an amount that made the room go quiet. More than Edwin Bennett earned in half a year of farming, this was not the act of desperate men scraping together pennies. This was deliberate. This was real. Charlotte leaned over Eliza's shoulder. "The 15th, that's less than 2 weeks away." "Well, Eliza," Edwin Bennett's voice had gone hard the way it always did when he was making calculations that involved his daughter's futures. "What do you have to say for yourself?" Eliza looked up from the letter. Her eyes moved from her father's stern face to her sister's gleeful expressions. They wanted her to confess, to stammer, to crumble. They wanted her to refuse and become the laughingstock who could not hold on to a husband she had never met. But something crystallized inside her as she stood there holding Garrett Dawson's straightforward words. Something clear, hard, unbreakable, like ice forming on still water. "I'll go," she said quietly. The room erupted. "You'll what?" Vivian's face went white as milk. "Eliza, don't be absurd," Charlotte sputtered. "There are 3 of them on a mountain alone with 3 strange men." Rosalie began to cry. Eliza looked at each of her sisters in turn. She had spent 24 years being looked through, talked over, dressed in cast-offs, and introduced as the spinster sister. She had spent 24 years watching herself be erased from rooms and conversations and futures. And she was done. "You didn't think they'd actually respond," she said. "You didn't think I'd actually go." She turned to her father. "This gentleman and his brothers have made an honorable proposal. If you'll permit it, Father, I'll accept." Edwin Bennett studied his youngest daughter for a long moment. Whatever he saw in her face, desperation or determination, or some dangerous mixture of both, seemed to satisfy whatever calculation he was running. "Very well. The men appear to be of good standing. I'll make the arrangements." "But Father," Vivian started. "Enough." His voice cut through her protest like an axe through soft wood. "Your sister has received an offer of marriage from respectable men. That is more than I dared hope for at her age." After their father left the room, Eliza felt 3 sets of eyes boring into her back. She turned to face them one final time. "Thank you," she said. "Truly, you've given me something I could never have managed on my own. A way out." She left them, standing in stunned silence, and then climbed the stairs to her small bedroom under the eaves. Only when the door was safely closed did she allow herself to unfold the letter again with shaking hands. "The choice is yours entirely." Was it though she was choosing between humiliation here and the unknown there, between slow suffocation and a leap into darkness, between being invisible forever and gambling everything on 3 strangers who lived on a mountaintop in Wyoming? Some choice, but it was more than she had ever been given before, and she would take it with both hands. The night before her departure, her mother found her. Margaret Bennett appeared in the doorway of Eliza's small room while she was folding clothes into her grandmother's old trunk. The evening light caught her mother's face and revealed something Eliza had never seen there before, something that looked like grief. "May I come in?" Eliza nodded, not trusting her voice. Her mother sat on the edge of the narrow bed and smoothed her skirts in a nervous gesture that Eliza had inherited. Those same restless hands, the same inability to sit still when emotions ran too close to the surface. "I know what your sisters did." Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "Vivian has a conscience buried somewhere. She came to me last night in tears." Eliza's hands stilled on the calico dress she was folding. "You don't have to do this. We can send word that you've taken ill." "No." The word came out harder than Eliza intended. She softened her voice, but not her resolve. "When has anyone in this family truly seen me? Mother really looked at me and seen who I am. You dress me in Charlotte's cast-offs because why waste money on new dresses for the plain daughter? Father forgot my last birthday entirely. Vivian introduced me to her suitor's business partner as just the spinster sister. I'm 24 years old and I'm already invisible." "That's not true." "Isn't it?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Eliza watched them form and felt nothing, or almost nothing. Something stirred far down beneath the numbness, something that might have been pity, but she could not afford pity right now. Pity would make her stay. "I've watched you, Mother. The way you look at me sometimes, I can see you wondering how you produce something so ordinary when your other daughters shine so bright." "Eliza, I'm not angry about it anymore. It just is what it is. But these men, these Dawson brothers, they have no expectations of beauty. They're not comparing me to Vivian or Charlotte or anyone else. They just want someone who can work hard and keep a house and be honest with them." Margaret's voice was small and broken. "And is that really enough for you? A marriage without love?" Eliza thought about the dances she had never been asked to, the suitors who had looked right through her, the future she could see stretching ahead with painful clarity. "Maybe love is overrated," she said. "Maybe respect and honesty are better foundations. At least they're real." Margaret looked at her daughter for a long time and something shifted behind her eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Or a kind of sorrowful understanding that came too late to change anything, but could still perhaps set something free. "You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for." "I've had to be." Her mother stood, then surprised Eliza by pulling her into a fierce embrace, the kind of embrace that held years of unspoken apology in its tightness. "Then go. Go and be strong and write to me. Not your father, not your sisters. Me. Tell me the truth about how you are." "I will," Eliza whispered. After Margaret left, Eliza returned to her packing. At the bottom of her trunk, wrapped in one of her own carefully mended shawls, was a music box that had belonged to her grandmother. It was the only beautiful thing she owned, the only heirloom that had come to her instead of to one of her prettier sisters. She wound the key and listened to the delicate melody fill her small room. Tomorrow she would board a train heading west, toward a territory she had only read about in newspapers. Toward three men she knew only through one brutally honest letter and one conspicuous silence. The music box played on Sweet and Sad, and Eliza Bennet let herself imagine just for a moment what it might feel like to be seen. The train carried her west for 3 days. She watched the landscape transform from the green familiarity of Missouri to the endless prairie of Kansas, then to the high plains where grass stretched to the horizon and the sky seemed impossibly vast. Like God had taken the roof off the world and left nothing between earth and heaven but empty blue air. Missouri was green and known, the color of safety, the color of the cage she had grown up in. Kansas was gold and flat and endless, stretching to a horizon that seemed to move away the faster you approached it. There were no hills here, no trees to hide behind, no walls, just open space and the terrifying, exhilarating realization that in a landscape with no edges, a person could be whoever they chose. Other passengers came and went. A family with noisy children who reminded her what she was heading toward, the reality of a 4-year-old boy who needed a mother. A dignified, elderly couple who held hands when they thought no one was looking, and Eliza wondered if that kind of love was real or just performance, and whether there was a difference. A young drummer in a check suit who kept trying to catch her eye until she made it clear through perfect stillness that she was not available for conversation. At night, she lay in her narrow berth and listened to the rhythmic clatter of the wheels. Each mile of track was a mile further from who she had been. Each hour carried her closer to who she might become. She wrote in her journal by lamplight. September 12, 1874. Somewhere in Kansas. I wonder what they look like. Garrett is 37, a widower. He writes like a man who has been hurt and has decided that the safest response to hurt is to stop feeling anything at all. I recognize this because I have done it myself in smaller ways every day for 24 years. The difference is that he chose numbness to protect himself from grief. I chose it to protect myself from hope, because hope for a woman like me has always been the cruelest feeling of all. She turned the pen in her fingers, watching lamplight play along its surface. The second brother, Colton, did not write at all. What kind of man refuses to acknowledge his future sister through marriage? A man who does not want her there. Or perhaps a man who is afraid. But of what? Emmett wrote about aspens and elk and beauty. Honesty is worth more than beauty, he said. I have never been beautiful, but I have always been honest, perhaps in this one place that will finally be enough. 3 brothers, 3 strangers, 3 chances to be disappointed, or 3 chances to begin again. I wonder which it will be. A second entry followed, written in smaller script, as though she was afraid of her own words. Garrett wrote that he is not a romantic man. I have been trying to decide if that frightens me or relieves me. Romance in novels always seems like a trap. All those breathless feelings and desperate passions that make sensible people act like fools. Maybe it is better to build something steady instead of something that burns bright and burns out. Or maybe I am just telling myself this because I have never had the chance to be romanced, and I am trying not to mind. The train pulled into Cheyenne on a bright September morning that felt like stepping into a different world. The air was thinner here, sharper, carrying scents Eliza had no names for. Sage and ust, and something wild that made her pulse quicken. The town sprawled in a jumble of false-fronted buildings and wide dirt streets. Cowboys and dusty chaps lounged outside saloons. A woman in a split riding skirt strode past with a rifle slung over her shoulder, and nobody gave her a second glance. Back home, such a sight would have caused a scandal. Here it was simply Tuesday. Eliza stood outside the telegraph office and stared at the door. She could still send word. She could still turn back. Her father would be disappointed but unsurprised. Her sisters would laugh themselves sick. Through the open door, she caught a glimpse of the telegraph operator fingers flying over the keys, sending messages racing along copper wires to distant destinations. She thought of Garrett Dawson's letter. I am not a romantic man. She thought of the platform in Pine Bluff, where three strangers would be waiting for a woman who existed only in a squinting photograph and a flowery letter she had not written. The door swung shut. Eliza turned away without entering. Some decisions once made should not be unmade by fear. 4 more hours on a smaller train, rattling north through a canyon where red rock walls towered overhead, then emerging onto rolling grassland that seemed to stretch to the edge of forever. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks dusted with early snow. The air grew colder, cleaner, sharp enough to taste. And then Pine Bluff Station appeared ahead, and the train stopped. And the conductor helped her down and unloaded her trunk with casual efficiency and tipped his cap and climbed back aboard. And within minutes, she was alone on a wooden platform at the edge of civilization, and the moment she had imagined for 6 weeks was here, and it was nothing like she had imagined because nobody had come until the footsteps. They emerged from the shadow of the station house, and the breath went out of Eliza's body like she had been struck. The first man was tall, not merely tall in the way that men in Missouri were sometimes tall, but tall in a way that seemed to alter the proportions of the world around him. 6 feet and 5 inches of lean, weathered strength, broad shoulders that blocked the light behind him, a face made of hard angles and sun-darkened skin with deep lines carved around eyes the color of good whiskey, dark hair touched with gray at the temples, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble. He wore work clothes, canvas pants, a plain shirt, a leather vest. He carried his hat in his hands as he approached, and his eyes studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she did not look away. She had promised herself she would not start this new life as a coward. The second man stood directly behind the first, bigger still, taller by 2 inches, broader through the chest and shoulders by a measure that seemed almost impossible, as if the same sculptor had carved both brothers, but used a heavier hand on this one. A scar ran from his left shoulder down and disappeared beneath an open leather vest. A thick rope of white tissue that spoke of terrible violence survived. His eyes were the same whiskey amber as his brother's, but darker, colder, full of something that looked like banked fury. His arms were folded across his massive chest, and everything in his posture said the same thing. I do not want to be here. The third man stepped out last, the smallest of the three, which still made him well over 6 feet tall, a leaner build, features that were softer, almost gentle compared to his brother's. He had the same dark hair, but is curled slightly at his collar. The same amber eyes, but warmer, touched with something that might have been humor or kindness. He was the only one who smiled. It was a small smile, barely a curve at one corner of his mouth, but it was there. Eliza stood before them. 5 feet 3 inches of rumpled traveling dress and windblown honey-colored hair and road dust. Her carpet bag clutched before her chest like a shield. She could feel how small she was in comparison. How absurdly, almost comically small. A sparrow standing before 3 hawks. The silence stretched between them, heavy with evaluation and uncertainty, and the enormous weight of what they were all about to do. The first man broke it. Miss Bennett. His voice was deep, the kind of voice that did not waste words or raise itself unnecessarily. It simply stated things and expected them to be heard. Yes, Garrett Dawson. He did not offer his hand. This is Colton, a nod toward the mountain of scar and muscle behind him. And Emmett. Emmett stepped forward. Welcome to Wyoming, Miss Bennett. How was your journey? Before Eliza could answer, Colton spoke. His voice was lower than Garrett's, rougher, like gravel sliding over iron. She's smaller than I expected. He looked her over from her dusty boots to her wind-tangled hair, making no effort to hide his assessment. A lot smaller. Are you sure you didn't get on the wrong train? Colton? Garrett's voice cut like a blade. What? Someone has to say it. Colton turned to his older brother, and there was challenge in every line of his massive frame. Look at her. She won't survive one winter at Eagle Ridge. The wind will blow her right off the mountainside. We discussed this. No, you and Emmett discussed it. I made it clear I wanted no part of this. Colton looked directly at Eliza, his amber eyes hard as polished stone. You should go back where you came from. We don't need more trouble. The words landed between them like a thrown gauntlet. Even the yellow dog raised its head, ears pricked, sensing the tension from 20 feet away. Emmett spoke quietly. Colton, that's enough. But Colton had already turned away. He walked toward the wagon in long, angry strides, each bootfall heavy on the wooden platform, and swung himself up onto a waiting horse with the ease of a man who had been riding before he could walk. He did not look back. Silence again. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and something Eliza could not name, something clean and vast and terrifying. Garrett looked at her. She could see him evaluating, measuring, running calculations behind those whiskey-colored eyes, deciding whether she was worth the trouble his brother had just promised. Eliza lifted her chin. It was instinct, the automatic response of a woman who had spent her entire life being found wanting and had learned to face the finding without flinching. "I don't blow away easily, Mr. Dawson." Something crossed his face. Surprise, maybe, or the faintest shadow of respect. "Wagons this way, 3 hours to the ranch. We should move before dark." He picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing at all and started walking. Emmett took the carpet bag from her hands before she could protest. "Let me carry that." His smile widened just slightly. "Don't mind Colton. He bites, but it's not always fatal." "It felt fairly fatal," Eliza said. Emmett laughed. The sound was warm and genuine and entirely unexpected after the cold wall of his brother's hostility. "All right, it might sting, but it won't kill you. Nothing on this mountain will if you're tough enough to outlast it." The wagon was plain but well-maintained, pulled by two sturdy horses who nickered softly as Garrett loaded her trunk. He offered his hand to help her up to the seat, and Eliza took it. His palm was rough with calluses. His grip was firm but careful. She could feel the controlled strength in his fingers, the way he measured his own force to avoid hurting her. He climbed up beside her. Emmett mounted a horse and rode alongside. Ahead, Colton was already a distant figure on horseback. His broad back turned toward them like a door slammed shut. The wagon lurched forward. Pine Bluff Station began to recede behind them, and with it, the last outpost of anything resembling the world Eliza had known. The road climbed. Prairie gave way to rolling hills. Hills gave way to pine forest that thickened with every mile. The air grew cooler, sharp with resin and snowmelt. The road narrowed until it was little more than a rutted track winding between massive trees. The wagon rocked and swayed, and Eliza gripped the seat with both hands. Conversation came in short, practical bursts. Garrett answered her questions the way he seemed to do everything with economy and precision. "How large is the ranch?" 5,000 acres deeded, another 3,000 in grazing leases, around 800 head of cattle, timber operation on the north slope. "Three of you manage all of that." "Three brothers, plus Hank Cooper. He's our full-time hand. We hire on extra help during roundup and drives." Emmett filled in the details Garrett left out. The way the aspens on the mountainside blazed like fire in autumn before dropping their leaves in a single windswept week. The elk herds that sometimes passed through the valley at dawn, moving like brown rivers through the morning mist. The sound of Bear Creek running almost year-round, clean water from the snowpack above. Garrett interrupted. "Wyoming is hard country. Beautiful but hard. Winters are brutal. Summers can bring drought. The work never stops." It sounded like a warning. Eliza nodded. "I'm not afraid of hard work." "I read that in your letter." There was something in his tone she could not quite identify. Not mockery, but not quite belief either. Then he added, almost casually, though the words hit Eliza with the force of a hammer. "The letter was too flowery. Didn't quite match what I saw in the photograph." Heat rose up Eliza's neck. "What do you mean?" Garrett kept his eyes on the road. "Most people lie with their eyes. Put on whatever face they think the world wants to see. But your eyes in that photograph, they look tired and honest and real. Like someone who'd stopped pretending." He paused. "The words in the letter said one thing. Your eyes said another. I chose to believe the eyes." Eliza's breath caught. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. No one had ever looked at her, at the plain, forgettable surface of her, and seen past it to anything underneath. "You'll marry me if you're agreeable," Garrett continued in the same flat, practical tone. "That's the arrangement. You'll manage the house, look after my son Jack. I'll provide for you, protect you, treat you with respect. All three of us live in the same house. Colton and Emmett will be there. You need to know that." "I understand." "Colton won't be easy." He paused for a long time. He has his reasons. Reasons connected to things I'm not ready to explain right now. The words hung in the mountain air, creating a mystery that settled into Eliza's mind like a splinter. What had happened here? What had made Colton Dawson into a wall of fury and scar tissue? And what did it have to do with her being here? When the sun was nearly gone, they crested a final rise and Garrett pulled the horses to a stop. There. Eliza looked where he pointed, and the world tilted beneath her. Eagle Ridge spread across the valley below like something from a painting. The main house was larger than she had imagined, a sprawling structure of logs and stone with a wide porch wrapping around three sides nestled against a mountainside thick with pine. Outbuildings clustered nearby. Barns, a stable corrals, various sheds all maintained with obvious care. Beyond them cattle dotted the grassland, like dark punctuation marks on a golden page. Bear Creek itself caught the last of the twilight glinting silver as it wound through the valley floor. Lamplight glowed in the house windows. Smoke rose thin and straight from the chimney into the still evening air. "It's beautiful," Eliza whispered. "Beautiful and lonely," Garrett replied. "Nearest neighbor is 10 miles. Town is half a day's ride. Winter can cut us off for weeks at a time." The quiet pride in his voice was the most emotion she had heard from him since they met. Emmett, riding alongside, spoke softly. "But when spring comes, there's no place on earth more beautiful." The wagon started down the slope. A dog began barking as they approached, and a small figure appeared on the porch silhouetted against the lamplight spilling from the open door. Jack Dawson was 4 years old. He had dark curls like his father and bright blue eyes that must have come from his mother. A scattering of freckles across his nose, a gap where he had lost a front tooth. He stood in his nighted clothes with Mrs. Calloway, a silver-haired woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and an expression that gave nothing away, holding his shoulder. "Papa, is that the lady from the letter?" Garrett lifted Eliza down from the wagon. His hands were so large they nearly encircled her waist entirely. "Yes, this is Miss Eliza." Mrs. Calloway looked Eliza up and down with the cool assessment of a woman who had survived enough winters to know what mattered and what did not. "Small little thing, aren't you? At least you won't eat much." But her eyes were warmer than her words. The house interior was dim lit by oil lamps, but the impression was of solidity. Heavy furniture, clean floors, no clutter. This was a man's space, practical and spare and empty of anything soft or decorative. A house that had forgotten what beauty looked like, or perhaps had stopped caring. Her room was at the end of the ground floor hall, small, a narrow bed with a thick quilt, a dresser, a washstand, a single wooden chair, a window that looked out toward what she thought might be the barn, though it was too dark to tell. "It was Sarah's sewing room," Garrett said, and for the first time she heard something like apology in his voice. "I had it converted. It's small, but it's yours. I'm upstairs with Jack. Colton and Emmett are upstairs as well." The mention of Sarah, the dead wife, the room where a dead woman had sewn, was now where a living woman would sleep. The weight of that was not lost on Eliza. "Tomorrow," Garrett said. "Pastor Mitchell is riding out at first light. I figured there was no point in waiting." He studied her face. "Unless you need time. Tomorrow is fine. What difference would waiting make?" He nodded and turned to go, then stopped. From the hallway came the sound of heavy boots on stairs, and Colton appeared at the end of the corridor. He had not changed from the clothes he wore at the station. The open vest, the scarred chest visible beneath, the folded arms, the jaw set like granite. He looked at Eliza, then at Garrett, and the air between the two brothers became something almost physical. A pressure, a weight. "You're really going to do this?" Not a question. "Yes." Colton stepped closer. He was enormous in the narrow hallway, his shoulders nearly touching both walls. "You're bringing a strange woman into this house, into Sarah's house, into Sarah's sewing room, and tomorrow you'll put Sarah's ring on her finger." "Sarah has been gone 5 years, Colton. She's gone because—" He stopped himself. Something raw and dangerous had been about to come out, something that burned in his amber eyes like fire behind glass, and he caught it just in time. His gaze flickered to Eliza, who stood with her back against the wall, her blue eyes wide but dry, her small frame rigid but unbroken. Then back to Garrett. "You'll regret this." Low, almost a whisper. But each word carried the weight of a hammer blow. He turned and climbed the stairs, each step like thunder. The door to his room closed so hard the oil lamps flickered in their brackets, and the house seemed to shudder around them. Silence settled over the hallway like dust after an explosion. Emmett appeared from the kitchen doorway. He had clearly heard everything but had stayed out of the way with the instinct of a youngest brother who knew when to let the older ones fight. "I'm sorry about Colton," he said to Eliza. "He carries things, heavy things, and he doesn't know how to set them down." "He's afraid it will happen again," Eliza said quietly. "Whatever happened before with Sarah, he's afraid of a repeat." Both Garrett and Emmett went still. The silence lasted too long to be casual, too long to be anything other than confirmation. "We all carry wounds," Emmett finally said, "in different ways." Garrett drew a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and painful. "Get some rest, Eliza. Tomorrow will be long." He went upstairs. The sound of his door closing was quiet, controlled. Nothing like Colton's explosive exit, but somehow just as final. Emmett lingered. "Do you need anything?" "I'm fine," but her voice trembled at the edges. He nodded. "You're brave, braver than you know." Then he too was gone. Eliza closed her door, sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and for the first time since boarding the train allowed her hands to tremble without trying to stop them. She opened the music box. The tinkling melody filled the small room, delicate and impossibly sweet against the rough log walls, a bridge between the girl she had been and the woman she was about to become. A soft knock interrupted the music. "Eliza, I have supper." She opened the door. Garrett held a tray laden with stew, fresh bread, and black coffee. The aroma hit her empty stomach like a fist. He set the tray on the dresser, and his eyes found the music box. Something unreadable crossed his face. Pain, perhaps. Or memory. "I heard music." He stood still for a moment, listening to the delicate notes, as though they were something he had not expected to hear ever again. "Sarah used to play piano. Not well, but she enjoyed it. I haven't heard music in this house in 5 years." He paused at the door, his broad frame filling the space between the log walls. It was good hearing it again. He left before she could respond. Eliza ate slowly, savoring the rich stew. Through the window came the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. Horses moving in the barn, the distant lowing of cattle, the wind in the pines. And somewhere upstairs, the sound of a man pacing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Colton, not sleeping, trapped with his ghosts. She wound the music box one more time and let it play as she settled into the narrow bed in the small room in the house on the mountain that was, as of tomorrow, going to be her home, surrounded by men who were still more mystery than family, in a territory she had only read about in newspapers. Married in a matter of hours to a man who had told her plainly that he was not romantic, who had offered honesty instead of love, and whose eyes, those whiskey-colored, calculating, careful eyes, had looked at a squinting photograph of a plain girl from Missouri and seen something that nobody else in 24 years had ever bothered to look for. The music box wound down to silence. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. Somewhere on the mountain, a wolf called out long and lonesome, and another answered from the darkness beyond the valley. Eliza closed her eyes and waited for morning and whatever it would bring. The wedding was simple enough to be almost brutal. Morning light slanted through the parlor windows, cutting pale rectangles across the plank floor. The room smelled of pine smoke and coffee and the particular stillness that settles over a house when something important is about to happen and nobody is entirely sure they want it to. Pastor Mitchell arrived at first light, a weathered man in his 60s with kind eyes and a firm handshake, and the unhurried manner of someone who had married enough couples in remote country to know that the ceremony mattered less than what came after. He opened his Bible on the kitchen table and adjusted his spectacles and waited for the household to assemble with the patience of a man who understood that some things cannot be rushed. Jack sat on the parlor sofa, swinging his legs, watching everything with the solemn gravity of a child who knows something important is happening, even if he does not understand what. His dark curls were combed, which meant someone, probably Emmett, had wrestled him into presentability. His blue eyes? Sarah's eyes moved from face to face with the careful attention of a boy who had learned early that the moods of the adults around him determined the weather of his world. Emmett stood to one side as witness. His face was serious, but his eyes were warm. Colton stood in the doorway, not inside the room, not gone from the house, just there on the threshold, arms folded back against the frame, his massive shoulders filling the space, the way he filled every space he entered. He would not participate, but he would not leave. The significance of that was not lost on Eliza. He could be anywhere on 5,000 acres of mountain. He chose to be here, watching, unable to walk away from something he claimed to want no part of. Garrett stood beside her in a clean shirt that smelled of soap. His jaw was freshly shaved. The effort he had made, however small, told Eliza that this mattered to him in ways his careful control would never let him say. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Mitchell began. Eliza barely heard the words. She was too aware of Garrett beside her, tall and solid, the warmth of his body close to hers in the cool morning air, the way his hands hung at his sides, those enormous calloused hands that could gentle a horse and swing an axe and apparently write letters of such brutal honesty that they could pull a woman halfway across a continent. "Garrett Dawson, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." "Steady, sure." "Eliza Bennett, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" This was it. After this, she would be bound to this stranger in the eyes of God and law. There would be no going back to Missouri, no returning to her small room under the eaves, to her sister's laughter, to her father's indifference, to a life of quiet erasure. "I do," she whispered. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Garrett, you may kiss your bride." Garrett hesitated. For one fractured second, uncertainty broke through his careful control, the first real crack Eliza had seen in his composure. Then he bent down slowly, giving her time to pull away. She did not pull away. His lips brushed hers light as breath over in a heartbeat. But in that brief contact, she felt the calluses on his hands where he cupped her shoulders, smelled leather and soap, sensed the leashed strength in the way he held himself so carefully gentle, as though he were afraid of breaking something fragile. Then he stepped back, and it was done. Jack jumped off the sofa and ran to them, his small boots thumping on the wooden floor. "Are you my mama now?" Eliza looked down at this child who would never remember his real mother. The small boy with his dark curls and his blue eyes and his gap-toothed smile looking up at her with a hope so pure it cracked something open in her chest that she had not known was sealed. "Yes," she said softly. "I suppose I am." "Mud, Papa said you'd teach me to read." "Did he now?" She glanced at Garrett, who had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Jack has been asking," he said gruffly. "I can teach him numbers and ranch work, but reading." "I can teach you," Eliza told the boy. "I used to help at Sunday school back home." From the doorway, Colton made a sound. It might have been a sigh. It might have been something else entirely. He turned and disappeared before Eliza could read his expression. But in the instant before he vanished, their eyes met, and what she saw in his was not hatred. It was something more complicated. Pain, perhaps. And beneath the pain, something that looked against all odds, like the faintest, reluctant flicker of acknowledgement. Garrett pulled something from his vest pocket, a simple gold band. This was Sarah's. "I want you to have it." Eliza stared at the ring. "I can't. It was hers. It wouldn't be right." "She's gone, Eliza. And you're my wife now. Sarah would have wanted it used, not sitting in a box collecting dust." His voice roughened with something that might have been old pain or new resolve. She held out her hand. Garrett slipped the ring onto her finger. It was slightly too large, loose enough that she would need to be careful. But the weight of it felt like an anchor, a promise, a reminder that this was no longer a dream or a joke or a mistake. It was real. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, already turning away. "I need to get to work. Cattle don't care about weddings. Jack, you help Mrs. Dawson today, you hear?" "Yes, Papa." And then he was gone. Boots heavy on the porch, his voice calling to Hank about checking fence lines, and the ordinary sounds of a working ranch swallowing up the extraordinary fact that Eliza Bennett had just become Eliza Dawson. She stood in the parlor wearing a dead woman's ring in a house she did not know, married to a man she had met yesterday, surrounded by mountain wilderness she had only read about in newspapers. Jack tugged her hand. "Want to see my room? Papa says I have to keep it clean now that you are here." "I would love to see your room," Eliza said, and she let the boy lead her into her new life. The first weeks passed like water over stones, smoothing some edges, revealing others, reshaping everything they touched. Eliza threw herself into her new role with the desperate determination of someone who knew that failure meant returning to everything she had escaped. She rose before dawn and had breakfast ready when the men came in from early chores. She cleaned and cooked and learned the rhythms of ranch life, the way a musician learns a new instrument, one note at a time, feeling for the pattern beneath the noise. Mrs. Calloway came twice a week, and each visit was a masterclass in mountain survival, delivered with the blunt efficiency of a woman who had buried two husbands and raised four sons in country that forgave nothing and forgot less. Mr. Garrett and his brothers eat big meals, Mrs. Calloway explained, as they stood in the well-stocked pantry. Breakfast at dawn, dinner at midday, supper at dusk. Ranch work burns energy. Cook plenty. Always have coffee ready. Keep bread fresh. Wednesday is baking day. Thursday is laundry. What about Jack? Same as the men, just smaller portions. He's a good eater, no fussing. Mrs. Calloway paused, her sharp eyes softening for just a moment. He's a good boy. Lonely but good. The men try their best, but a child needs a mother. The weight of that statement settled on Eliza's shoulders. A child needs a mother, and she was supposed to be one despite having no idea what she was doing. But she learned, the way she had always learned, by watching, by listening, by doing the work until the work became part of her. Mrs. Calloway taught her to read the sky for coming weather. Low clouds from the northwest, temperature dropping fast, that meant prepare. Bring the livestock close. Fill every container with water. Stack wood higher. She taught Eliza which hens were the best in layers and which ones would peck your hand if you reached under them without speaking first. She taught her that the bay mare copper would bite if you cinched her saddle too fast, and that the old gelding parson would follow you anywhere for a sugar lump. The daily routine carved itself into Eliza's body like water carving stone. Her hands, soft from a life of indoor mending, developed new calluses from chopping wood and kneading bread and hauling water. Her arms grew stronger from lifting cast iron pots and wringing wet laundry and carrying Jack when his short legs tired on their walks to the creek. Her face took color from the mountain sun and the sharp wind until she looked less like a china figurine and more like a woman who belonged. It was harder than anything she had done in Missouri. But the fundamental difference transformed the nature of the work itself. In Missouri, she had been invisible. Here, every effort mattered. She cooked, and three men said thank you. She mended a torn shirt, and Emmett wore it the next day with a nod of appreciation. She scrubbed the kitchen floor, and the whole room brightened. For the first time in her life, Eliza felt the cause and effect of her own existence. She was not invisible here. She was necessary. Each of the Dawson brothers inhabited her new life differently. Garrett was courteous and appreciative of her efforts, but emotionally he remained behind a wall so high and thick that Eliza could not even see the top of it. He slept upstairs. He rose before her. He worked until dark. He maintained careful, perfect distance. They were husband and wife on paper, and strangers in practice, orbiting each other like planets that shared a sun but never touched. Emmett was warmth itself, the first to compliment her cooking, the first to call her by name instead of Mrs. Dawson, the first to treat her like family rather than an employee. He showed her his woodworking shop behind the barn, where he carved with a patience and skill that transformed rough timber into art. Horses for Jack, each one different, each one detailed down to the individual tail hairs. Chess pieces for winter evenings. A small wooden box with a hinged lid that he was sanding smooth. "What's it for?" she asked. "Things worth keeping," he said and smiled. Colton remained a fortress. He ate with the family but did not look at Eliza. He answered her questions in single syllables. He left his dirty plate on the table as though testing her, and she cleared it without comment, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. But there were cracks in his wall, small ones, barely visible but real. One morning she was struggling with a heavy water bucket, and he appeared from nowhere, took it from her hands without a word, set it on the kitchen floor, and walked away. The action contradicted everything he said. Eliza noticed. She noticed everything. She had spent 24 years learning to observe, and now that skill was her compass in this unfamiliar country. Jack became her constant shadow. He talked without stopping. A running commentary on everything from ants to clouds to the complex politics of the barn cat hierarchy. His energy should have been exhausting. Instead, it was the opposite. There was something healing about his uncomplicated acceptance. He did not care that she was plain. He did not compare her to anyone. He simply held her hand and showed her his world, and in the showing made her part of it. Reading lessons happened every morning at the kitchen table after breakfast. His small finger traced the shapes of letters, while Eliza guided his hand, and his progress was swift enough to surprise even her. He had his father's sharp mind. It had simply been waiting for someone to feed it. 10 days after the wedding, she was putting him to bed when the boy asked the question she had been dreading. "Did you know my first mama?" Eliza's hand stilled on the quilt she was tucking around him. "No, sweetheart, I never met her. Papa doesn't talk about her. Uncle Colton doesn't either. Uncle Emmett sometimes tells me she liked to sing, but I can't remember her voice." His blue eyes looked up from the pillow. "Is that bad?" "No, Jack. You were very young. It's not bad at all." "Do you think she would have liked me?" The question broke something inside Eliza that she had not known was there. Something sealed shut long ago in a house in Missouri where nobody asked her such questions because nobody thought she had answers worth hearing. "She loved you more than anything in the world, Jack. Your papa told me so. Will you stay here forever? Promise you won't go away." "I promise." His small fingers found her hand and held on with a fierce, trusting grip that only a child can manage. "I'm glad you came. Papa is less sad now." The observation delivered with a 4-year-old's devastating honesty hit Eliza like a stone. Was Garrett less sad? She could not tell. He seemed the same to her. Controlled, distant, unreachable. But perhaps Jack saw what she could not. Perhaps children read the hearts of their fathers the way map makers read mountains, finding paths invisible to everyone else. Then she opened the piano. It sat in the parlor against one wall covered in 5 years of dust. Sarah's piano shipped from Denver at great expense, the instrument that had not been touched since the day she died. Eliza lifted the cover almost on impulse and pressed a single key. The note rang out slightly flat from years of disuse, but still sweet, still alive. The sound filled the room the way water fills a dry creek bed, rushing into spaces that had been empty so long they had forgotten what fullness felt like. Jack came running. "You can play." "A little. My grandmother taught me." She sat on the bench and played a simple melody from childhood. Her fingers stumbled over notes they had once known by heart. The music filled the empty room like light filling a cellar. Jack climbed up beside her and she showed him how to find middle C, how to press the keys gently instead of banging them. He had his father's long fingers. He would be good at this someday. They were still playing, Jack experimentally plunking keys while Eliza corrected his finger positions when she felt a presence in the doorway. Not Garrett, not Colton. Emmett stood there with his shoulder against the frame, his eyes closed, listening. When she stopped, he opened them. "Don't quit on my account." "I'm sorry, I should have asked before touching the piano." Sarah hated that piano by the end. Emmett's voice was quiet. Said it was too loud in such a small house. "But I always liked the sound." He paused. "Play it, please. This house has been quiet long enough." That evening after Jack was in bed, Emmett found Eliza in the parlor and asked if she would play something else. She played the melody her grandmother used to hum on winter evenings in Missouri. Simple and aching and old. Emmett sat and listened with an expression of such peace that Eliza wondered when he had last been at rest. "You have an artist's soul," she told him. He reddened. "Don't say that in front of Colton. He'll say I have a girl's soul." Would he be wrong? Emmett laughed, surprised. Probably not. And the warmth between them, the ease of it, became one of the first true friendships Eliza had ever known. Not a friendship built on beauty or status or what she could offer in a parlor full of suitors. A friendship built on music and honesty and the quiet recognition of two people who both knew what it felt like to be the gentle one in a family of hard edges. Winning Garrett required a different currency, not warmth or music or conversation, but competence of a kind he recognized and respected. One evening after Jack was asleep and the house had settled into its nighttime stillness, Eliza asked to see the ranch accounts. Garrett looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression she had not seen before. Not suspicion exactly, but surprise. The kind of surprise that comes when something you thought was decorative turns out to be functional. "You want to see the books?" I want to understand our operation. If you want a partner, treat me like one. He opened the ledgers and she bent over them with the quiet intensity that came from years of watching her father manage the farm accounts. Edwin Bennett had taught his daughters basic bookkeeping, believing even girls should understand money, though he had never let Eliza near his actual records. She had always been too plain to be worth investing in, too ordinary to deserve real responsibility. But she had learned by observation. She had always learned by observation. These feed costs seem high for autumn, she said, pointing to a column of figures. Are you buying supplemental hay? Garrett stared at her. Had a dry summer. Hay crop wasn't what it should have been. And here are these entries for supplies from Henderson's store in Pine Bluff. The prices are higher than wholesale by almost 20%. Is there no other supplier? For the first time since she had arrived at Eagle Ridge, Garrett Dawson looked at Eliza not as a problem he was managing or an obligation he was fulfilling, but as a person with a mind that worked in ways he had not anticipated. You're good with figures, he said. My father taught me. He said even daughters should understand money. From that day forward, Garrett began sharing the workings of the ranch with her. Every few days, he spent an hour walking her through cattle operations, market conditions, grazing rotations, the delicate balance of income and expense that kept a homestead afloat. Eliza absorbed it like drought-starved earth absorbs rain. She asked questions that sometimes made him pause and reconsider plans he had already made. You should sell that south strip to your neighbor Drummond, she said one afternoon, studying the survey map spread across his desk. Not the whole parcel, just the narrow piece along the creek that's too rocky for decent grazing. It connects two of his larger sections and gives him water access year-round. He'd pay above market for that kind of strategic value. Garrett went still. That's not a bad idea. The railroad expansion next year will increase land values across this whole region. He knows that. He'll want to consolidate now while prices are still reasonable. Use the money to improve irrigation on the north section where the grass is better. When did you become a cattle baron? Garrett asked, and there was something in his voice she had not heard before. Something warm, something that sounded almost like pride. When you started treating me like a partner instead of another mouth to feed. The words landed between them honest and sharp, and Garrett held her gaze for a long moment before nodding slowly. You're right, I did that. I apologize. It was the first time he had apologized for anything. The first admission that he had seen her as less than what she was. The small moment felt like a door opening an inch. Not wide, but enough to let in a little light. Winning Colton seemed impossible, but the mountain had its own timing and cracks appeared where Eliza least expected them. One morning early enough that the light was still gray and the frost still silver on the window panes, Eliza came downstairs to find Colton in the kitchen. He was trying to repair the stovepipe that had come loose in the night wind, and a jagged edge of sheet metal had opened a long cut across his palm. Blood dripped steadily onto the floor she had scrubbed the evening before. She did not ask permission. She went to the medicine cabinet Mrs. Calloway kept stocked, took out clean cloth, and carbolic wash, came back and took his hand. I don't need help, Colton growled. Your hand is bleeding on my clean floor. She held his hand in both of hers. It was enormous. Her fingers could not reach around his palm. The skin was rough with calluses, layered over calluses, the knuckles scarred from a lifetime of hard work and harder living. She cleaned the wound and wrapped it with the quick, practiced motions of a woman who had been mending things her entire life. While she worked, she was close enough to see the bear scar in detail for the first time. It started at his left shoulder and carved a brutal path down across his ribs, disappearing below his belt line. The tissue was thick and ropey white against his tan skin. And there were other scars too, smaller ones on his hands, his forearms, his knuckles. A life written in damage. Bear scar, he said, because he had caught her looking. 3 years ago, Grizzly caught me checking trap lines. Garrett shot it off me. Emmett stitched me back together. Did it hurt? Nearly killed me, 3 months before I could walk again. He looked down at her hands on his, her small fingers working the bandage. Doesn't it bother you? No. Eliza tied off the bandage and looked up at him. Scars just mean you survived. Colton stared at her. For the first time since they had met on that platform in Pine Bluff, there was no hostility in his amber eyes. No anger, no wall, just surprise. and beneath the surprise, something tender and unguarded that he covered up so quickly she almost missed it. Like a man who opens a door by accident and slams it shut before anyone can see what's inside. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. The first he had spoken to her that were not a criticism or a dismissal. 2 words that cost him something to say. Eliza received them like gold. The first trip to town came on a Saturday in late October. Garrett drove the wagon with Eliza beside him. Colton and Emmett rode horses on either side. The image of it, one small woman flanked by 3 enormous men, caused a sensation in Pine Bluff that would feed the gossip mill for weeks. At the Mercantile, Josephine Keller found them. She was golden-haired and sharp-eyed, and beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful, like a well-polished blade. Her smile could cut glass. She appeared between the dry goods shelves as though she had been waiting, which Eliza suspected she had. "Garrett, this must be the new bride." Her blue eyes ran over Eliza's plain traveling dress, her simple hair, her lack of jewelry beyond Sarah's loose ring. The assessment was thorough. The verdict was clear. Found wanting. "What a surprise to hear you'd married. You've always been so particular." "Eliza Dawson," Eliza said, offering her hand with a calm she did not feel. Josephine took it briefly, the way one handles something of uncertain cleanliness. And it must be quite an adjustment, living with 3 men so far from civilization. "I live with my husband, his brothers and his son," Eliza corrected gently. "Like any family." Behind her, from the direction where Colton stood, Con stood with his arms folded and his hat pulled low, came a small, unexpected sound. A laugh. Brief and rough and barely there, but unmistakable. The first time Eliza had ever heard Colton Dawson laugh. It was the sound of a man who had not expected to be surprised and was annoyed at himself for enjoying it. Outside the Mercantile, they encountered Marcus Harlan for the first time. He was tall and well-dressed, with a smile that slid across his face like oil on water. He intercepted them on the boardwalk with the easy confidence of a man who owned half the buildings on the street, which he did. He shook Eliza's hand and held it a beat too long. She pulled it back. "My offer on your south section still stands, Dawson. Prime grazing land, top dollar." "Not interested," Garrett said, his voice the temperature of creek water in January. "Everything has a price, Dawson. Think about it." After Harlan walked away, the Eliza asked who he was. Garrett explained. "Banker, owned half the businesses in town, had been trying to buy ranch land for years, consolidating it under his control." Then Colton spoke, and the words stopped Eliza cold. "Don't ever be alone with him." His voice was low and serious and carried no trace of the hostility he usually reserved for her. This was not rejection. This was warning, pure and urgent. "Why, boy? Because I don't like the way he looks at you." Colton's jaw was tight, like something he wants to own. It was the first time he had said anything that sounded like protection rather than dismissal. The first time his instinct to guard had extended beyond his brothers and his nephew to include the woman he had tried to send away. Eliza filed it away with all the other small contradictions that made up the puzzle of Colton Dawson. The man who said she should leave but carried her water bucket. The man who would not look at her but noticed how another man did. The dinner at the Keller Ranch the following Sunday was exactly the ordeal Eliza had expected. The house was ostentatious, expensive furniture that looked transplanted from an Eastern parlor. Lace curtains in a territory where most women counted themselves lucky to have glass in the windows. Josephina's mother fussed with false hospitality, while her father talked cattle prices with Garrett. And Josephine spent the entire meal finding ways to remind everyone that she had known Garrett since childhood, that she understood this country in ways a newcomer never could, that certain women belonged in certain places and certain women did not. "Remember the summer dance when we were 16, Garrett? You were so gallant." "I don't recall," Garrett said flatly. Then Josephine turned her attention to Eliza, her voice sweet as arsenic-laced honey. 3 men, 1 woman, so far from town. People do talk, you know. The things they say are not kind." "Josephine," her mother murmured, but there was no real reproach in it. "I'm only trying to help." Josephine Haspai was a masterpiece of controlled malice. She should know what she's gotten herself into. Garrett Dawson is not an easy man to be married to. He's cold, distant, married to that ranch more than he ever was to. That's enough. The words came out of Eliza harder than she intended. Hard enough to silence the table. Hard enough to make Josephine's mother set down her fork. Hard enough to make Garrett turn and look at his wife with an expression she had never seen on his face before. My husband is a good man who works hard to provide for his family. I won't sit here and listen to speculation about my marriage or comparisons to his first wife. Eliza met Josephine's eyes without flinching. She had spent 24 years being evaluated by women who were prettier than her, sharper than her, more confident than her. She had spent 24 years shrinking from exactly this kind of confrontation. But she was not in Missouri anymore. She was on a mountain in Wyoming, and the rules here were different. Here you either stood your ground or the wind blew you away. And Miss Keller, if you wanted Garrett, you had 5 years. You didn't try. I did. That is the difference. Dead silence. The kind of silence that fills a room after lightning strikes and before the thunder arrives. Then from the hallway behind the dining room, Colton's voice. He had been listening from the other side of the wall. 2 words. Quiet, rough, carrying a weight that seemed to alter the balance of something that had been tilting since the day Eliza arrived. Well said. On the ride home, the wagon rocking gently down the mountain road in the darkness, Garrett reached across the seat and took Eliza's hand. His calloused fingers wrapped around hers firm and warm, and he did not let go for the entire descent. The warmth of his grip in the cold mountain air was the first physical tenderness he had shown her since the brief, careful kiss at their wedding. Thank you, he said, for defending me. You're my family. I protect what's mine. Emmett, riding alongside, grinned in the darkness. I think Josephine Keller won't be inviting us to dinner again. Even Colton, riding ahead, made a sound that might have been agreement. It was a small moment, a tiny crack in the ice. But small cracks, Eliza was learning, were how mountains eventually broke open. That night she could not sleep. She went downstairs for water, her bare feet quiet on the cold plank floor, the house dark except for moonlight through the windows, painting the log walls in silver and shadow. She filled her glass at the kitchen pump and was turning to go back to her room when she heard voices from the front porch. Colton's voice, low and rough, carrying something that sounded like pain. She doesn't belong here. Nobody belongs here except us. And Emmett, gentle but firm, with an edge Eliza had never heard from him before. You can't live like this forever, Colton. You can't blame her for what Sarah did. The silence that followed was so complete that Eliza could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Not what happened to Sarah. What Sarah did. The distinction was a door opening onto a room full of questions that Eliza was not yet ready to enter. But she stood in the dark kitchen, with the glass of water forgotten in her hand, and felt the words rearrange everything she thought she knew about this house and the people in it. Whatever had happened here, it was more than a woman dying in childbirth. It was more than grief. There was guilt here, and anger, and a secret that all 3 brothers carried differently. Garrett carried it in silence. Emmett carried it in gentleness, and Colton carried it in fury. Colton again quieter now. She's like Sarah, small, fragile. She'll hate this place within 6 months. She is nothing like Sarah. Emmett's voice held an edge that could have cut leather. Benning, and you know it. Eliza retreated to her room without making a sound. She sat on her bed in the darkness and stared at the wall, the glass of water growing warm in her hands. She opened her journal and wrote by moonlight. October 5th, 1874. Eagle Ridge. I have been married 3 weeks. My husband sleeps upstairs. 2 floors of timber and an ocean of silence between us. His middle brother wants me gone for reasons I do not yet understand. Reasons tangled up with a dead woman in a secret that nobody will speak. His youngest brother says I am brave. His son holds my hand and calls me mama and looks at me like I am something precious. She paused, the pen hovering over the page. And me, I am doing what I have always done. Mending, cooking, cleaning, making myself useful. But for the first time, instead of feeling invisible for it, I feel necessary. These 3 men need someone. This house needs someone. This child needs someone. Perhaps I am that someone. She set down the pen and wound the music box. The tinkling melody filled the small room, delicate against the rough log walls. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. Somewhere on the mountain, a wolf called out long and lonesome, and another answered from the darkness beyond the valley. Or perhaps Colton is right, she wrote the pen, finding the page again in the moonlight. Perhaps the wind will blow me off the mountainside, but I do not think so. I have been blown around enough in this life. It is time to take root. She closed the journal, extinguished the lamp, and lay down in her narrow bed in the house on the mountain to wait for morning and whatever it would bring. Knowing only this, that somewhere above her, three men carried a secret heavy enough to bend them. That somewhere in the walls of this house, a dead woman's shadow still fell across every room. And that the words she had overheard on the porch, those 6 words, "What Sarah did," were the key to a door she would eventually have to open, whether she was ready or not. The weeks that followed the dinner at the Keller Ranch brought a slow, careful thawing. Not dramatic, not sudden. The kind of change that happens the way spring happens on a mountain, so gradually that you do not notice it until one morning you look up and the world is different. Garrett stopped disappearing into his study after supper. He sat in the parlor instead, sometimes reading, sometimes watching Eliza teach Jack his letters by lamplight, sometimes just sitting in a companionable quiet that no longer felt like avoidance but like trust. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of two strangers maintaining careful distance. It was becoming the silence of two people who had begun to understand that not everything needed to be said aloud. He began to share himself in pieces, the way a man who has been locked away for 5 years opens a door not all at once but an inch at a time, letting in a little more light with each opening. He told her about his childhood, his father's relentless drive to build Eagle Ridge from nothing but a land grant and sheer stubbornness, working from before dawn until after dark, driving himself and his 3 boys toward a vision of permanence that left no room for rest or tenderness. His mother's gentle voice reading fairy tales by lamplight, the same book Eliza now read to Jack each night. The morning he found his father face down in the north pasture, dead at 55, from a heart that had worked as hard as the rest of him and given out first. "I always swore I wouldn't end up like him," Garrett said one evening, staring into the fire. "Working until I dropped. Building something so big it swallowed me whole. Forgetting there were people in the house who needed more than a roof and a payroll." He paused. The fire popped and sent a shower of sparks up the chimney. "But I did. I ended up exactly like him." He told her about the early years after his father's death. 3 brothers, barely more than boys, inheriting 5,000 acres and 800 head of cattle, and absolutely no idea how to manage any of it. How they learned by failing. How Colton took on the hardest physical work because his body seemed designed for punishment. How Emmett handled the animals because he had a gift for understanding creatures that could not speak. How Garrett managed the business because someone had to and he was the eldest, and the eldest always carries the heaviest load. "Emmett was the one who convinced me to place the advertisement," Garrett said. "He said I was turning into our father, said Jack needed a mother and the ranch needed a woman and I needed someone." He paused. "Colton said he'd rather die than watch another woman die in this house." The words fell between them like stones into deep water, sending ripples outward through the warm parlor air. Eliza sat very still and let the ripples settle. "Sarah died here," she said. Not a question. A statement requiring nothing but confirmation. And then, on a November evening with the fire burning low and snow pressing against the windows and Jack long since asleep upstairs, Garrett told her the truth. "Everyone thinks I love Sarah so much I couldn't move on. And I did love her, but by the end we'd made each other miserable. She wanted society and culture and conversation. I wanted to build this ranch. We were wrong for each other in every way that mattered, and neither of us was brave enough to admit it." He stared into the fire with the expression of a man who had spent 5 years looking at the same memories and seeing the same failures. "That last winter she barely spoke to me. Then she was pregnant. She begged me to take her to Denver for the birth. A real hospital, real doctors. But I thought she was overreacting. Thought women had been having babies on ranches since the beginning of time. Thought the midwife would be enough." His voice cracked, just barely, a fissure in stone. "I was wrong, and she died for it. The midwife couldn't get through. Snow blocked the road. Emmett rode all night in the blizzard looking for help. Came back with nothing. Colton was the one who stayed with her, the last person to hold her hand. Then the confession that had haunted him for 5 years, the words he had never spoken to anyone. When she died, I felt guilty, but I also felt free. What kind of man feels free when his wife dies? A human one, Eliza said softly. She took his hand and held it, firmly without judgment. The way you hold something that is precious and broken and does not yet know it can be mended. A man trapped in an unhappy marriage, feeling relief doesn't mean you didn't love her. It just means you're human. Something passed between them in the firelight. Recognition. Two damaged people seeing each other's scars and choosing not to look away. An understanding that lived deeper than language in the place where lonely people recognize each other across the distance of their separate solitudes. I've been punishing myself for 5 years, Garrett said, refusing to let anyone close, building walls, and then you showed up, honest and plain and trying so hard to be useful. And you got past the walls, Eliza. I don't know how, but you did. He drew her close, not with passion, not with urgency, with something rarer and more honest. The way a man holds something he has realized is precious only after nearly losing it. And Eliza let herself be held, feeling the steady hammer of his heart against her cheek, breathing in the smell of wood smoke and leather and coffee that was simply Garrett. 3 days before the worst storm in 5 years, a mail rider from town made the long climb to Eagle Ridge with a bundle of correspondence, letters from Eliza's mother, a supply catalog, and one envelope addressed to Mr. Dawson Eagle Ridge in handwriting that Eliza recognized with a jolt of pure dread. Vivian's handwriting. The letter did not reach Garrett first. It reached Colton. Eliza was in the kitchen kneading bread dough when Colton walked in and the look on his face stopped her hands in the flour. He set the letter on the table with the careful precision of a man placing a loaded weapon. "Read it," he said to Garrett, who had just come in from checking the barn. Garrett read. His expression did not change. The wall of control held perfectly, but his hands tightened on the paper until it crumpled at the edges. Emmett read over his brother's shoulder. His eyes went wide. Then they found Eliza's, and in them she saw something that looked like grief. She knew before anyone spoke. The way the blood left her face must have confirmed it. Vivian, driven by guilt or cruelty or some mixture of both, had written to confess everything. "We sent Eliza as a joke," the letter said. "We wrote the letter in her name. We chose the worst photograph. We never imagined anyone would respond. Eliza is innocent in this, but you should know the truth about how this arrangement began." "I can explain," Eliza started. Colton's voice cut through the kitchen like a winter wind. "Explain what? That you're a joke, that your own family sent you here to humiliate us, that even the people who know you best think you're worthless." "Colton," Emmett began. "No, I said from the beginning, I said don't trust this. I said there would be trouble." Colton turned to Garrett. "And you married her. Put Sarah's ring on her finger. Let your son call her mother. And the whole time she knew she was sent here as a joke." Eliza forced her voice past the tightness in her throat. "I did not know what the letter said. I knew my sisters wrote it, but you still came." Colton's eyes were the color of dark amber, and they burned. "Knowing it was their joke, you got on that train." That was the truth. She had known it was a joke. She had come anyway, and there was no argument clever enough to make that fact disappear. Garrett spoke at last. His voice was flat with exhaustion. "Everyone out. I need to speak with my wife. Alone." Colton left. The door slammed hard enough to shake the dishes in the cupboard. Emmett lingered, looking at Eliza with pain in his eyes, then followed. Garrett and Eliza faced each other in the empty kitchen, while outside the first flakes of what would become the worst storm in 5 years began to fall. "Tell me everything," he said, "from the beginning." And she did. All of it. The laughter through the window, the daguerreotype where she was squinting, the decision to go because it was the only door that had ever opened for her, the terror of stepping off the train, the shock of seeing 3 men instead of one. "I didn't come here to humiliate anyone," she said, her voice shaking but holding. "I came because this was the only chance I'd ever had. My sisters wanted to make me a laughingstock. Instead, they gave me something I could never have got to on my own, a way out of a life where I was nothing." Garrett was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind began to moan around the eaves and the snowfall thickened until the barn was barely visible through the kitchen window. "I don't care what the letter said. I care what you are." He stood and his shadow fell across her. "But right now I don't know what you are." I need time. He walked out. The door closed behind him. Not slammed. Closed. Quiet and controlled, and somehow worse than any slamming could have been. Eliza stood alone in the kitchen while the blizzard began to howl outside the windows. 3 men had turned their backs. Garrett needed time. Colton wanted her gone. Even Emmett, gentle Emmett, had not stayed to defend her. She had 2 choices: leave when the storm broke, return to Missouri, accept her fate as the unwanted daughter who could not hold on to even a marriage that had never wanted her in the first place, or stay, fight, prove herself. Not with words, because words were what had gotten her into this, but with work, with the only currency she had ever been able to spend: actions, not words. Eliza dried her eyes, rolled up her sleeves, and started cooking. 3 days the storm raged. 3 days of 4 adults and 1 child locked in a house where the tension was thick enough to chew. 3 days of wind that screamed like something alive, and snow that buried the world to its waist. And through all 3 days, Eliza did not stop working. She rose before dawn, though dawn was barely distinguishable from night in the storm's perpetual gray. She built the fire, heated water, made coffee, cooked breakfast, eggs, bacon, biscuits, pancakes thick and golden, coffee black and strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe nail. She set the table for 5 and waited. When the men came in from fighting through snow to check on livestock, their coats crusted white, their faces all and red, their hands numb despite heavy gloves, they found a warm kitchen, a hot meal, and a woman who did not ask them to speak to her. She did not beg or explain or weep. She simply did what needed doing, and she did it well. She let the doing speak for her. The first day, no one spoke to her except Jack, who sensed the wrongness in the air but was too young to understand it. He climbed into her lap with his picture book and pressed his small body against hers. "Mama Eliza, why is everyone sad?" "Everyone is tired from the storm, sweetheart." The second day, 2 calves were lost in the blizzard. Garrett came in with his jaw clenched and his shoulders carrying the weight of failure. Every loss on a ranch in winter is a calculation. Less livestock means less income, means the margin between survival and catastrophe grows thinner. Eliza set a plate of hot stew in front of him without a word. He ate. He looked at her. He did not speak, but he nodded. A small acknowledgement. A crack in the wall. That evening, Emmett found her washing dishes. "I'm not angry with you, Eliza." His voice was soft, carrying the particular gentleness of a man who had watched a woman suffer and could not bear to add to it. "I understand why you came. If I'd been in your place, I'd have gotten on that train too." She said nothing because her throat was too tight for words, but she touched his arm briefly, and he understood. The third night, the wind began to ease. The house settled into an exhausted quiet, and Colton came to her door. He filled the doorway the way he filled every space he entered. He leaned against the frame and looked at her where she sat on her narrow bed, a blanket pulled around her shoulders, her grandmother's music box silent in her hands. "I don't hate you, Eliza." He used her name. The first time. The sound of it in his rough voice was strange and somehow sacred. "I never hated you." She waited. She had learned by now that Colton spoke in his own time, or not at all, and pushing only made him retreat. "Sarah came from the city, small like you, not used to mountain living. She was miserable here. Hated the winters, hated the loneliness, hated that Garrett loved this ranch more than he loved her." His voice dropped lower, and she was right about that. By the end, she barely spoke, just stared out the windows like she was in prison. And then she was pregnant, and then the storm came, and then the midwife couldn't get through. He pressed his palms against his eyes. The gesture was so raw, so unguarded that Eliza felt she was seeing something no one was ever meant to see. The inside of a wound that had never healed because the man carrying it would not let anyone close enough to stitch it shut. "I was with her when she died." I held her hand, and the last thing she said to me was, "I'm sorry, Colton, I'm sorry." I still don't know what she was sorry for dying, for being unhappy, for not being strong enough to survive this place. The silence that followed was so complete Eliza could hear the wind easing outside, the storm spending itself against the mountain. "I thought anyone who came here would be the same," Colton continued, "small and soft and broken by the first real winter. I thought you would hate it here, would suffer the way Sarah suffered. And I couldn't. His voice cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but enough. I couldn't sit beside another bed and hold another hand. I wasn't strong enough for that again. But you're not like her. He looked at her now, really looked, and his amber eyes held none of the hardness she had come to expect. You don't complain. You work. You get up every morning and cook for men who won't speak to you. You bandaged my hand and didn't flinch at the scars. And I've been watching you, Eliza. These weeks I've been watching. And you are nothing like Sarah. He straightened in the doorway. Stay. That's not an order. It's a request. Then he was gone, his footsteps heavy on the stairs but somehow lighter than before, as though the words he had finally spoken had taken weight from his body that he had been carrying for 5 years. The fourth day dawned clear and cold and blinding white. The storm was over. The world was buried under 4 feet of snow and the sun turned everything to diamond. Garrett found Eliza in the kitchen, doing what she always did, making breakfast, keeping the household alive. I've been thinking, he said, about the letter, about the joke. She waited, hands dusted with flour, heart in her throat. You came here because you needed a way out. I placed that advertisement on because I needed a way out. Neither of us lied about what we are. We just both came to this from desperate places. He sat down at the table. The letter your sister wrote was a lie, but you're not a lie. These weeks weren't a lie. The way you've cared for Jack wasn't a lie. No. I suspected the letter was false from the beginning. It was too flowery, didn't match the truth I saw in your eyes in that photograph. He met her gaze and held it. I chose to believe the eyes. I still do. He reached across the table and took her hand. For the first time, the gesture felt like a choice rather than an obligation. You cooked for us all 3 days, he said. Every meal, even though we gave you nothing but silence. Why? Because it was the work that needed doing, and because I don't prove myself with words. I prove myself with what I do. Something in Garrett's face broke open. Not dramatic, not tears or confessions or grand gestures. Just the faintest softening around his eyes. The slightest relaxation of that iron jaw. A smile that was barely a curve at the corner of his mouth, but that transformed his whole weathered face into something she had never seen before. Something that looked like peace. You're right, he said. You do. In the weeks that followed, the ice between them thawed in ways both visible and invisible. One evening with the fire burning low, and the house wrapped in the deep silence of a mountain winter, Garrett asked her to share his room. Not with pressure, not with expectation, with a simple, quiet statement that he did not want walls between them anymore. Eliza looked at this man who had said he was not romantic, who had offered her only honesty and work in a life that asked everything and said yes. The door closed softly behind them. When morning came, everything had changed. Everything that mattered had been said without words in the language of trust and tenderness. Eliza woke with Garrett's arm across her shoulders and the first real certainty she had known since boarding that westbound train. She belonged here. Colton's transformation was not spoken aloud. It was demonstrated. Firewood appeared beside the kitchen stove before Eliza was awake, split and stacked with military precision. The water bucket was full every morning. A new shelf materialized in the bedroom, built with rough joinery that was unmistakably Colton's work. He never mentioned any of it. One morning, a bunch of dried wildflowers appeared on the kitchen table. No note, no explanation. Emmett saw them and his eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. Flowers. Colton picked flowers. From the doorway, Colton growled, "Shut up." But his ears were red. Christmas came to Eagle Ridge on a blanket of fresh snow, and for the first time in 5 years, the house wore decoration. Eliza and Jack had spent 3 days cutting paper snowflakes and stringing garlands of dried pine boughs. A small pine tree stood in the parlor corner, trimmed with ribbon scraps and tin stars that Emmett had cut and hammered in his workshop. Gifts were exchanged with awkward tenderness. For Garrett, Eliza had spent weeks working on something that made her hands ache and her eyes burn from close stitching by lamplight. A quilt pieced together from fabric that told the story of their first months together. Blue from her traveling dress, brown from one of his worn-out work shirts, red from a flannel of Jack's that the boy had outgrown. In the center, she had embroidered the ranch brand and the date of their wedding. Garrett stared at the quilt. His rough fingers traced the stitching. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "You gave me a home," she said simply. "I wanted to give you something that showed how much that means." He pulled her into his arms in front of everyone. "I love you," he said. "God help me. I love you." From the hallway, Colton's voice carried in dry and rough. "You were too polite." He was talking about the letter Garrett had written to Eliza's sisters the week before, telling them the woman they mocked had more courage and beauty than anyone he had ever known. "Nobody asked you," Garrett said. "Should have let me add a few lines." "Absolutely not." All three of them were smiling, and the sound of laughter in the house on the mountain was something none of them had heard in a very long time. January brought cold that cracked the air like glass, and January brought Marcus Harlan. He did not come to Eagle Ridge himself. He was too clever for that. Instead, he began a campaign of quiet destruction designed to isolate the Dawsons and break them piece by piece. First, the rumors. Whispers spread through Pine Bluff like smoke under a closed door. The mail-order bride was a joke. Her own family sent her as a prank. 3 men living with 1 woman on that mountain. What kind of arrangement was that, really? Then the economic pressure. Harlan called in loans from neighboring ranches, tightening financial screws on families who had been operating on thin margins for years. The Peterson family, who shared a boundary fence with Eagle Ridge and had traded labor during Roundup for a decade, suddenly stopped coming to help. The Hendersons began avoiding Eliza at the general store. Then in late January, the fire. Eliza woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of Colton's voice roaring from the yard. Not words, just a raw bellow of rage that cut through the night. She ran to the window and saw the orange glow against the snow. The hay storage, a third of their winter feed supply going up in flames that turned the night sky the color of a false sunset. All 3 brothers and Hank fought the fire for hours. Eliza hauled water and beat embers with wet blankets and choked on smoke until her lungs burned. Jack watched from the upstairs window, with his face pressed against the glass, his wooden horses clutched in both hands. By dawn, they saved most of the hay, but lost enough to make the rest of winter precarious. The men stood in ash and snow faces black with soot. "Harlan," Colton said. One word, flat and certain as a hammer strike. "Can't prove it," Garrett replied. "Don't need to prove it. Need to end it." But ending Harlan required evidence. And evidence required exactly the kind of careful, patient, invisible work that neither Colton's fists nor Garrett's stoic endurance could provide. It required Eliza. She began her investigation in February during the long, dark evenings when wind howled outside and the men sat by the fire mending tack. She wrote letters to the county courthouse requesting copies of land transaction records. She talked to Mrs. Calloway, who knew the history of every property sale in the region. She spoke quietly with neighboring ranchers' wives at the church socials that Pastor Mitchell organized to keep winter isolation from driving people mad. The skills her father had taught her, the bookkeeping and the attention to numbers that no one in her family had ever valued, now became her weapon. She read through stacks of documents by lamplight, eyes burning, fingers stained with ink. She cross-referenced dates, signatures, property descriptions. She created a ledger of her own, mapping every transaction Harlan had touched for 5 years. Piece by piece, she assembled the puzzle. Harlan's lending practices were predatory. Loans with terms buried in language so dense that most homesteaders, men and women who had spent their lives working land rather than reading contracts, did not understand what they were signing. When payments were missed even by a single month, Harlan exercised clauses that transferred land rights at fractions of their true value. 4 families had lost their properties this way. None had realized they had been cheated until it was too late, and all of them were too ashamed to tell anyone. Garrett helped her understand the land laws. Emmett drew detailed maps showing disputed parcels. And Colton did something nobody expected. He went to the neighboring ranches himself. He talked to the men who had lost their land. He heard their stories. He gathered their willingness to stand up and speak. "Since when does Colton talk to people voluntarily?" Emmett asked, genuinely astonished. "Since someone showed him that talking can be a weapon too," Garrett said, and looked at Eliza. The spring town meeting in early April, the annual gathering in the meeting hall behind the church, a plain wooden building that smelled of lamp oil and sawdust. On this particular afternoon, it was packed to the walls. Harlan sat in the front row, legs crossed, hands folded, his oiled smile in place. He had no idea what was coming. Eliza asked to speak. Sheriff Morrison gave her the floor. She stood. 5 feet 3 inches of calico dress, braided honey-colored hair, and steady blue eyes. The smallest person in a room full of cattlemen and miners and frontier wives who could shoe a horse and shoot a rifle and deliver a calf by lantern light. She looked like she could blow away in a stuff wind. She did not blow away. "I want to talk about land," she said. Her voice was clear and calm and carried to every corner of the room. "Specifically, I want to talk about how several families in this district have lost their land through lending agreements they did not fully understand." She laid her documents on the table before Sheriff Morrison. Weeks of work made physical. Copies of loan agreements with predatory clauses highlighted. County records showing incomplete tax filings. Original deeds compared to transfer documents showing discrepancies in dates and signatures. Tom Henderson, a weathered man in his 60s, stood slowly. "She's right. I signed papers I didn't understand. By the time I realized what I'd agreed to, my land was gone. I was too ashamed to tell anyone." Agnes Pritchard stood next. Then Will Dawson, no relation. Then Ruth McGraw. 4 families. 4 voices that had been silenced by shame now speaking, because a small woman from Missouri had sat in their kitchens and listened to their stories and said the words they needed to hear. "This is not your fault, and you are not alone." Harlan rose, his face the color of raw beef. "This is absurd." The word of a mail-order bride, a joke sent by her own family against a respected citizen of this community. Eliza did not flinch. She had been flinching for 24 years, and she was done. "I may have been sent here as a joke, Mr. Harlan. That is the truth, and I have never denied it. My sisters thought it would be amusing to send the plain daughter to 3 mountain men and see what happened." She paused. "What happened is that I found a home, found a family, and I found records that show you have been stealing land from your neighbors through contracts designed to deceive." Sheriff Morrison examined the documents. "These are serious allegations. I'm opening a formal investigation." From the back of the room where Colton stood with his arms folded and his shoulders against the wall like a man guarding a door, 2 words carried across the crowded hall. Quiet, rough, unmistakable. "Well said." Harlan looked around the room. The faces that had always smiled at him, deferred to him, owed him, were now closed and hard and turned away. He left without another word. But cornered men are dangerous men. 2 days later, outside Henderson's Mercantile, Harlan appeared on the boardwalk with 2 hired men flanking him. Hard faces, deliberate stillness, hands resting near their belts. "Your wife has made a serious mistake, Dawson." "My wife told the truth," Garrett said, setting down the sack of flour he was holding. "If that's a mistake, it's one I'm proud of." "The truth. The truth is that your mail-order bride has destroyed a reputation I spent 20 years building." One of Harlan's men shifted his weight. His hand moved toward his belt in a gesture that was too deliberate to be casual. Colton stepped forward. He did not step forward the way most men step forward, with hesitation or calculation or concern for what might happen next. He stepped forward the way an avalanche steps forward, the way a grizzly steps forward, with the absolute terrifying certainty of something that has decided to move and will not be stopped by anything short of God or geology. He put himself between Eliza and the 2 hired men. His chest was a wall. His scarred shoulder faced them like a shield. Every inch of his 6'7" frame radiated a single unmistakable message. "Touch her." Colton said, his voice so low it was almost subterranean, "and I will take you apart." What happened next was fast and ugly and over in seconds. The closer of Harlan's men lunged not at Colton, at Eliza. A grab, a shove. Colton caught the man's arm and twisted. There was a sound like a green branch snapping. The second man came from the side. Garrett and Hank piled in. Emmett pulled Eliza back, shielding her with his own body. By the time Sheriff Morrison came running, both hired men were on the ground, and Colton was leaning against the wagon with his hand pressed to his left shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers. The old bear scar had torn open not from a bullet or a blade, but from being slammed sideways into the iron edge of the wagon during the struggle. Morrison arrested Harlan and his men on the spot. Nobody spoke in the banker's defense. The town had made its judgment. Eliza knelt beside Colton on the boardwalk. His face was white beneath his tan jaw, clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping. But his eyes were clear and focused, and fixed on her face. "You all right?" he asked. His first words after being wounded were not about himself. They were about her. "Me, you're the one bleeding all over the sidewalk." "Just a scratch." He tried to grin, and it came out as a grimace. "Ask the grizzly about real scratches." "Why did you do that? Why did you step in front of me?" Colton looked up at her, this enormous, scarred, broken mending man who had wanted to send her away the day she arrived and who had just put his body between her and harm without a second's hesitation. "Because you're family," he said, "and Dawsons protect family. That's all there is to it." Doc Brennan stitched Colton's shoulder into the back of his office while Colton gripped the arms of the chair and said nothing. The doctor, a lean man with steady hands and a dry wit, surveyed the damage with professional detachment. "Third time something's had a go at this shoulder. Bare barbed wire and now a wagon wheel. You might consider protecting your other side for a change." "I'll take it under advisement," Colton said through his teeth. The ride home was quiet. Colton sat in the wagon bed, propped against the sideboard's arm in a sling, face the color of old plaster. Eliza sat beside him because sitting beside a man who had bled for her seemed like the least she could do. "You were reckless," Garrett said without turning around. "I was effective," Colton replied. "You could have been killed." "Could have, wasn't. I'm alive. She's alive. Harlan's in a cell. I call that a successful Tuesday." Emmett from horseback shook his head. "He's impossible." "I've always been impossible. You just didn't appreciate it before." Colton's recovery took 2 weeks, during which he proved himself the worst patient in the history of medicine. Eliza brought meals, changed bandages, read to him from the book of fairy tales that had been Garrett's as a boy. He complained. She ignored the complaints. He grudgingly submitted. She worked with gentle, efficient hands. And in the quiet moments between the arguing and the bandaging, something healed that had nothing to do with his shoulder. "I'm sorry," Colton said one afternoon, staring at the ceiling while she wound fresh cloth around the wound. "For everything. The way I treated you when you first came. The things I said, telling you to go back. You deserve better." "You were forgiven a long time ago, Colton." "Why? Because I understood. You weren't angry at me. You were angry at the idea that life could go on without Sarah. Angry that someone could take her place. Nobody took her place." He turned his head to look at her. "You didn't replace Sarah. You built something new, something different, something she could never have built because she didn't have what you have. What's that grit?" The word was blunt, unadorned, the highest compliment Colton Dawson knew how to pay. "You've got grit, Eliza, the real kind, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself." Jack visited daily. "Uncle Colton, Mama Eliza says you got hurt saving her. She says you're a hero." "I'm not a hero, boy." "Mama Eliza says you are." "Mama Eliza talks too much." But his eyes were bright, and when Jack climbed onto the bed and curled against his uninjured side, Colton put his good arm around the boy and held him there. And Eliza watched from the doorway as something that had been locked inside Colton Dawson for 5 years quietly, finally, irrevocably broke free. The sisters came in June when the valley was at its most magnificent. 3 Bennett women in Eastern finery bouncing up the mountain road in a hired wagon, gripping the sideboards with white-knuckled hands. Charlotte saw the Dawson brothers emerging from the barn first. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Good Lord, there are 3 of them, and they're all—" "Charlotte, compose yourself," Vivian hissed, though her own composure was visibly strained. Garrett approached with measured courtesy. He did not smile. Colton stood behind him, arms folded, scar visible, his full 6'7", radiating a very specific message directed at the 3 women who had tried to destroy his sister through marriage. The message required no words. Then Eliza appeared on the porch. 6 months of mountain air and honest labor, and being loved by a good man, had changed her in ways that went deeper than skin. She was still small, still plain by the standards her sisters used to measure beauty. But there was a steadiness to her now, a groundedness, that made the word plain feel like the wrong word entirely. And she was pregnant. 6 months along her belly, round beneath her cotton dress. The visible proof that this life she had built was not just surviving, but growing. "Hello, sisters." Vivian wept when she apologized. Real tears. "I'm sorry. For the joke, for all the years, for every time I looked at you and saw nothing. You gave me this life, Eliza said. You should not have been cruel. But without the cruelty, I would not be here. That doesn't excuse it, but it transforms it. The worst thing you ever did to me became the best thing that ever happened to me. I don't know what to call that except grace. One evening, Eliza looked through the kitchen window and saw Colton teaching Vivian to split firewood. His patience was extraordinary, his low voice guiding her through each swing of the axe, his huge hands adjusting her grip with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a man his size. Vivian laughed when the wood finally split clean, a sound of pure and calculated delight. And Colton, watching her, allowed himself a smile that he probably did not know was visible. A real smile, the kind that reached his amber eyes and softened the hard lines of his face. There was hope for Colton yet, when he was ready, when his scars had healed enough to let someone touch them. The baby came in September, exactly 1 year after the day Eliza stepped off a train in Pine Bluff and saw three strangers waiting on a platform. Garrett had made arrangements with military precision. They traveled to Denver, hotel near the hospital, 2 doctors, a private nurse. He inspected every corridor of the hospital himself until the director began to wonder if the man was planning to buy the building. Colton positioned himself outside the maternity ward and did not move. For 3 days before labor began, he sat in a wooden chair with his back against the wall. A nurse asked if he was the father. No, he said. I sat at home last time. She died. I'm not sitting at home again. The nurse did not ask him to move after that. Labor came on a September evening. The 3 Dawson brothers paced the corridor like caged animals. Garrett walked back and forth, his face carved from granite. Emmett sat with his elbows on his knees, lips moving in what might have been prayer. Colton stood against the wall with fists clenched, staring at the closed door as though sheer force of will could keep death on the other side. The night was long, the longest any of them had ever known. Then dawn came. Pale light crept through the hospital windows, and with it came a sound that erased 5 years of grief and fear and guilt. The thin, furious, glorious cry of a newborn child. Mother and daughter are both healthy. They named her Sarah Grace, Sarah, because that name deserved to live on in something joyful rather than sorrowful. Grace for the grace that had brought a plain girl from Missouri to a mountain in Wyoming and given her everything she had never dared to hope for. Colton stood at the window, his massive frame very still. She looks like her mother, he said quietly. Then he looked at Eliza, and something in his amber eyes completed a journey that had begun the day she stepped off that train. A journey from hostility to tolerance, to respect, to protection, to something that could only be called love, though he would never use the word. No, Colton said. She looks like Eliza. She's beautiful. 30 years later, the porch that Garrett Dawson built with his own hands had been widened twice and repaired 3 times and worn smooth by decades of boots and bare feet and rocking chairs. It wrapped around the house the way the mountains wrapped around the valley, as though it had always been there, as though the house would not be complete without it. Eliza Dawson stood on that porch in the late afternoon light of a September day in 1904, her honey hair now threaded with silver, her hands marked by 30 years of work that she would not trade for anything, and watched her grandchildren chase each other through the wildflowers that carpeted the meadow between the house and the creek. Garrett stood beside her, 67 years old, slower now, his back not as straight as it once was, his dark hair gone entirely silver. But those whiskey-colored eyes still looked at her the same way they had looked at her that first afternoon at Pine Bluff Station, when she stood before him in a dusty traveling dress and lifted her chin and said the words that became the foundation of their life together. I don't blow away easily, Mr. Dawson. She had not blown away. 30 years of mountain winters and summer droughts and cattle drives and broken fences and sick animals and long nights and early mornings and the endless, beautiful, back-breaking work of building a life from nothing but honesty and effort and stubborn refusal to be defeated. She had not blown away. Jack was 34 now, tall and broad and running the ranch with the same quiet competence his father had shown at that age. He had married a school teacher from Pine Bluff, and their 2 children, a boy and a girl, were the ones currently screaming through the wildflowers with the boundless energy of creatures who had never known a moment of unhappiness. Sarah Grace was 30, sharp and capable and beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with the particular radiance of a woman who knows exactly who she is. She had married the town doctor, and they lived in Pine Bluff close enough to visit every Sunday. Thomas, their second child, born 3 years after Sarah Grace was 27, with his father's amber eyes and his mother's determination. He rode the Wind River Range the way Emmett had once ridden it, with a reverence for the land that no amount of civilization could breed out of a man who had grown up watching elk move through dawn mist. Emmett had married the Pine Bluff schoolteacher's sister, and they lived in a cabin he had built himself on the eastern edge of the ranch property. His woodworking had evolved from hobby to art, and people came from as far as Cheyenne to commission his work. He still played piano in the parlor on Sunday evenings, the melody Eliza's grandmother used to hum the song that had become the family's song, passed down through 3 decades of firelight and winter evenings, in the particular kind of peace that comes from being exactly where you belong. And Colton, 63 years old, still enormous though time had rounded some of his edges and slowed his stride. The bear scar had faded to silver on weathered skin. He sat on the porch beside his wife, a woman who had once sent her sister west as a cruel joke and had ended up following her to the very mountains she had mocked. Vivian Dawson, formerly Vivian Bennett, had returned to Eagle Ridge 2 years after that first visit. She came alone carrying a single trunk and a letter she had written to Colton during 18 months of correspondence that neither of them had ever mentioned to anyone. She stepped off the stage in Pine Bluff, and Colton was there, hat in his hands, and he did not say a word. He simply took her trunk and put it in the wagon and drove her up the mountain, and that was that. Some love stories begin with grand gestures and passionate declarations. Theirs began with silence and a carried trunk, and it was no less real for being quiet. The grandchildren ran past the porch in a shrieking blur. Colton's granddaughter, a 4-year-old, with her grandmother Vivian's golden hair, and her grandfather Colton's stubborn jaw, stopped long enough to demand that he pick her up. He did, settling her on his knee with hands that were still enormous, still scarred, still capable of extraordinary gentleness. "Tell me the bear story, Grandpa." Again. Again. "There was a bear," Colton said. "It was big. I was bigger. The end." "That's not the whole story. That's all the story you're getting." But he was smiling. The kind of smile that reaches the eyes and softens every hard line on a face that was once made entirely of hard lines. The kind of smile that says everything is exactly as it should be. Garrett reached over and took Eliza's hand. His grip was not as strong as it once was, but it was just as sure. They stood together on the porch he had built, looking out over the valley they had fought for, surrounded by the family they had made, and the late afternoon light turned the aspens on the mountainside to gold. "I still remember the photograph," Garrett said. "Tired eyes, honest, real. I chose to believe the eyes." "You never told me what you saw," Eliza said. "Not really, not past the honesty." "Courage," he said. "I saw a woman who had been beaten down by everyone she knew and was still standing. I saw someone who had stopped pretending to be something she wasn't, and I thought that's what I need. Not beauty, not charm, just someone real." He squeezed her hand. "I was right." Below them in the parlor, someone began to play the piano. Not Emmett this time. Jack's daughter, 10 years old, picking out the notes of the melody that Eliza's grandmother had hummed on winter nights in Missouri more than half a century ago. The notes drifted up through the floorboards and out through the open windows and into the mountain air, carrying with them everything that words could never hold. The house on the mountain that had been silent for 5 years when Eliza arrived was full of sound now. Full of life, full of the particular kind of beauty that cannot be seen with the eyes but can only be felt with the heart. She had been sent west as a joke. She arrived as the family disappointment, the plain daughter nobody wanted. But she had become something far more important than beautiful. She had become essential. She had become the center around which 3 broken men and 2 small children, and eventually a whole sprawling, noisy, loving family orbited like planets around a steady, warm, enduring sun. She had been told all her life that she was not enough. She believed it for 24 years. She did not believe it anymore. Because Garrett Dawson had looked at a squinting photograph and seen courage. Because Emmett Dawson had heard her play piano and found peace. Because Colton Dawson had tried to send her away and ended up bleeding for her on a boardwalk in Pine Bluff. Because a 4-year-old boy had taken her hand and called her mama and meant it with his whole enormous heart. Beauty Eliza understood now was not something you were born with. It was something you became. When you stopped hiding and started living. When you stopped apologizing and started belonging. When you opened yourself to love and let someone love you back exactly as you were. The cruel joke had become the greatest love story the Wind River Range had ever known. And the plain daughter, the one they sent away laughing, was the most beautiful woman on the mountain. Not because her face had changed, because someone had finally looked at her and seen. The music box still sat on the bedroom dresser. 30 years old now, its mechanism slower, its melody slightly worn. But sometimes on quiet evenings when the grandchildren had gone home and the house had settled into the deep peace of a September night, Eliza still wound the key and let her grandmother's song fill the room. A bridge between the girl she had been and the woman she had become. Between the life she left behind and the life she built with her own two hands in the wild, beautiful, unforgiving country that had finally taught her what she was worth. She was enough. She had always been enough. She would always be enough. And on a ranch called Eagle Ridge, in a valley ringed by mountains, in a house built by stubborn men, and held together by an ordinary woman who turned out to be extraordinary, that truth was known. It was lived. It was celebrated in every meal she cooked, every wound she bandaged, every lesson she taught, every ledger she balanced, every song she played. Every morning she rose before dawn to start the coffee and keep the world turning. Winter always ends, and what grows after is worth every cold and silent night that came before.